Welcome back to this masterclass from the European Open Source Academy. In these sessions, we have been looking at building and sustaining open source impact. My name is Amandine Le Pape. I am the head of the Business and Impact section in the European Open Source Academy, and I am walking you through how open source business owners and corporate users can drive the change. We have got to lesson number 3, which is about leveraging the right enablers. We've done so far a bit of background on Matrix and Elements to explain my experience around building and sustaining the open source impact. We've talked about recognizing the open source opportunity, why it's here, why it's important. Looked at the foundations which are required to set up successful open source business. And now getting into the levers that we will need to pull to sustain this business. So with a clear understanding on the foundations, the next step is determine the enablers, which are at your disposal, and how to tune them to your very specific case. So we have things like the choice of license to make, the value capture model, which is basically the sustainable business model which is going to fit your project, the community governance, and maybe more. So let's look at open source licenses. We've talked about it a bit in the previous lessons when we looked at the difference of the definition of open source. And we've said that the world of open source license is very busy. So there are hundreds of them, like 500 are tracked into the software package data exchange list, which is maintained by the Linux Foundation. However, only 80 to 90 are approved by the open source initiatives, which kind of define what open source means. And then we also have 10 to 15 of them, which are defined by the Free Software Foundation from the GNU project. There is overlap, but also differences between the OSI approved licenses and those defined by the Free Software Foundation. But basically they can be split into two main groups, the permissive licenses and the copyleft licenses. The permissive licenses mean that they allow the software to be used in proprietary works, whilst the copyleft licenses forbid the use of the software in non-copyleft works. But the granularity of it depends on the license. So if you have a software under copyleft license and you make some changes to it, then the license may force you to either open source the whole final project or just the changes you've made. We can look at a list of the most common licenses. There are many of them, but usually about six of them are very recurring and very prominent in the list. So looking at them from the most permissive to the least permissive. Started with the MIT one, which has almost no restriction. It just requires the attribution and license copy. The next one is the BSD3 clause, which adds the forbidding use of the author's name for endorsement. And then you get the Apache version, which adds explicit patent license and protection clauses. When you look at the most common copyleft licenses, the LGPL requires modification to the LGPL code to be released as LGPL2. The GPL1 requires all the distributed derived work to be released as GPL. And then the AGPL1, like the GPL, applies even when the code is accessed via the network. So the changes between all of these is pretty subtle, and you need to look at all the details in order to make the right choice. We've done a survey of the high-value open source players based on the kind of the valuations of companies. Some of them have been listed on stock exchange, etc. So this is from 2023, but gives a good idea of it. And the conclusion is basically that the companies which have the highest valuation in the end all use restrictive licenses. In terms of trying to set up a kind of framework around selecting your license, you can think of it via so of course it depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if you explicitly want the third parties to be able to use and monetize your software without any obligation to support the upstream, then you should be going permissive. This is really good if your goal is to get your code into as many hands as possible. You just want it to go viral. You just want everyone to use it. It is also good if you derive value not from the code, but from something else, which you are best to provide. So it might be services, it might be support, or you have a separate branding license. That basically the code is not the thing which is going to help you make more revenue. The very permissive licenses definitely encourage free riding, and it means that you may end up competing with someone who doesn't bear the development cost of the product itself, and they won't have any obligation to actually support and fund the upstream, i.e. you. So you develop some software, you put it out there under a very permissive license, nothing is stopping someone else to take it and sell it and compete with you on selling it without supporting you. We call it the tragedy of the commons, people taking open source for free and then making lots of profit out of it. On the other hand, if you want to ensure that people building on your code are actually obligated to keep their work open source, then you need to select a copyleft license. So it's really good if you to ensure that all the works which is derived from your work is going to either be open and that people cannot free ride on it. Because let's face it, what happens often is there is open source code, a big company will come, take it, change it, adjust it, and then resell it. And if you have a copyleft license in this case, this big company usually doesn't want to make it open, to make their final product open source. So they will be forced to go and pay you some licenses fee, for example, which is going in turn to support your business and help you fund your product development. So it gives the author the option to also provide the code under a commercial dual license, and basically it's a way to fund the open source work. So that means that many proprietary vendors won't touch your project. So it really brings a hurdle. Some companies see copyleft license and say, I don't want to touch this. And some developers cannot use your product because their company won't allow them to touch a project which has a copyleft license, because they don't want to carry the weight of having to look into the details and the fine lines and which license, etc. I understand whether what the developer is going to do means that they will need to open source the results. Too complicated, so there is a kind of blanket restriction to use copyleft licenses. So that's a bit of the drawback. Then comes the CLA. CLA is a contributor license agreement, which is basically a side agreement that may be used by some projects as a way to give the project more control over how it can use the third-party contributions. The same thing for for the licenses, each CLA is different. So it can be used for good. So for example, it can be used to give the project the opportunity to dual license the third-party contribution, so to fund the development of the project. So imagine you're a company, you put some open source code out there, external people, maybe from other businesses, contribute some features to it. If there is no contributor license agreement in place, then the company who did the project originally is not allowed to take the contributions and apply dual license to it, because they need the agreement from the contributor to do so. So having the CLA in place make it easier for the original author to put a dual license on it and get some funding from this dual license that has been set up. But it can also be used for evil. So for example, it can give the project the opportunity to what we call rug pull or rights ratchet, which means that the original author may take the contributions that were made by the community and move it into a proprietary project, and that's it. Like completely stop, just purely benefit from what has been provided by the community for its very own personal benefit. So when an open source project comes and say, oh, we are going to put a CLA in place, people sometimes may be worried. So either they trust the project and say, okay, good, that's fair enough, it's going to help you fund all this good software that you've been providing to the world, or they're going to go paranoid and say, oh my God, this is way too dangerous, you're going to rug pull us, and you are evil. So depends on how your community is seeing it and what you are trying to achieve, which is, so basically, yeah, it can be turned into a big obstacle for to get contributions, both from individuals, but also corporate contributors. Some of the corporations are going to put no-go on any contributions with the CLA. Sometimes the CLA may include some terms which ensure that the contributions must remain distributed as open source. So this is the way to protect against the rug pull, and this is what Signal or Element CLAs are doing. So that reassures a bit the contributor that the project is not trying to put a CLA in place for evil, but just to help itself stay sustainable. So let's talk about value. Open source creates value which is available to everyone, in particular the users, the developers, businesses, etc. Scott McCarthy has provided a definition of what we call the commodity value. It is basically the value that a customer believes that they can construct if they were given enough time and money. So basically, if I see a product which is not open source and I want a specific feature from it, and I have a product which is not as complete as the proprietary one, and I just want this feature on top of it, I have the choice of either go and pay for the proprietary product, or maybe spend the time to develop the specific feature on top of the open source version, which may be cheaper or easier than pay for it. If you get to the point where one of the features you have made available proprietary in your project is so easy to develop that it's going to end up in the open source version anyway, then it's not worthwhile. Like, it's easier to just put it directly into the open source. So one of the key enabler when you are doing an open source business is to determine this threshold. What is the threshold of the commodity value? So that you can then define the right balance between the value creation, so how much value is created by the business, and then the value capture, which is how much value turns into revenue for the business. So in other words, like, where do you draw the line between what is given away as part of the open source and becomes commodity value to everyone, and why do you keep as a bit of a differentiator and that you can commercialize? So there is a usual metaphor for this, which is called a moat. So the idea is to build sustainable moat. The question is, what is the moat which will ensure that your company can make some revenue, and how sustainable is it? How easy is it for people to just throw a bridge over the moat and take over your business? There are different types of value capture. We will get a bit deeper into the different business models in the next section, in the next lesson. But before that, we can look at which value can be potentially commercialized. Of course, focusing on the commercial open source always. But basically, we see 5 different types of value that can be potentially commercialized. First, there is the expertise. How much do you know of the project? And then you can commercialize it as support or development or training. That's the knowledge of your team. Then there is the service, like potentially provide hosting, different features, which may be either enterprise specific or features which add a lot of value for the end user. Then you may monetize peripheral tooling. So if you add dashboards, analytics to your open source projects, that's something which can be very valuable depending on what you develop, and that you can monetize. And finally, the marketplace, the partnership, the ecosystem. So all these different potential values, value creation, can lead to valid business models, which are going to support the growth of the open source adoption. And in the end, the community governance. So it's important to understand how you want to interact with the community, because the strong community brings resilience and energy to the project. So if the organization leading the project goes under, then the community can take over. So that's where the resilience comes from. The good community is going to bring growth and potential leads to the business. That's basically where the marketing angle we were talking about earlier, saying, why do an open source business? Well, if you have a good community, an active community, then you can create partnership. You can have individuals who try the project and then turn out to be potential customers later on, etc., etc. On the other hand, community can bring a lot of entropy. There are sometimes politics. There may be contributions that you need to take into account, which are not necessarily aligned with what you're trying to do. So there is a lot of positivity around the idea of having a community, but it's also definitely bringing some things which may slow you down. So in the end, community governance is a bit of an art, which can either turn into a blessing or a bit of a curse, depending on how successfully you are harnessing it. So to summarize all of these, there are several enablers which are available to an entrepreneur building an open source business. And figuring out which one to pull entirely boils down to answering one question. What is the mode that I can sustainably monetize? What is the value that I can capture and isn't become commodity yet? Once you have defined this, then the license would give you one framework, but then it's a matter of also selecting the standalone values and taking into account the status of your community.